The problem child, Jake Paul, isn't a stranger to accusations and fingers pointed toward him. This time, the Ohio-born box tuber is being called out for his recent two-fight proposition to UFC star Nate Diaz being nothing more than a smoke and mirrors act. Plus, Sugar Sean O'Malley gives his take on who would reign supreme between Jake and Nate Diaz. Let's dive straight in on today's video. First up, accusations. Jake Paul has officially announced that he will switch boats to the octagon. Fans were up in a frenzy when Paul dropped a video on his YouTube channel announcing the deal with Professional Fighters League, also dropping details on his first matchup. In an unorthodox two-fight speculation, Paul called out none other than the realest fighter on the planet, Nate Diaz. Jake challenged Nate to first face him in his domain in the ring, with their second bout to be inside the octagon. The matchup can get the ball rolling for the PFL's much-hyped super fight division, where each fighter is set to take a whopping 50-50 share from the pay-per-view. Jake's confidence and attitude towards the sport garnered massive respect from fighters, with many struggling to find reasons to hate him. That said, there was no amusing UFC middleweight champ Michael Bisping. The Count claims that Jake is merely ducking a legitimate fight in boxing. The hot take comes fresh out of the Believe You Me podcast, where Bisping acknowledged Nate's abilities, calling him a decent boxer, yet criticized his wrestling skills. He raised the question if Nate, as prolific as he is, can give the problem child attention. Jake's biggest fights have been against the who's who in MMA, with the likes of Ben Askren, Tyron Woodley, and most recently, legend Anderson Silva. Bisping claims to see through Jake's smoke and mirrors, and claims the fight is nothing more than a cash grab for Jake. The Count does have a point, with Nate well beyond his prime. You can say the same for all three veterans he's fought. Next up, Sean O'Malley predicts Jake versus Nate. Besides all the speculations, it's hard to disagree that Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz will sell many tickets. The bout just makes sense. Jake's chaotic persona on one end, with Nate Diaz being, well, Nate Diaz on another. Their auras complement each other, giving us some crazy WWE Attitude Era rivalry vibes. Analysts can criticize left, right, and center. The fans are already up and running, making predictions for how the fight might go. And among those excited, we have UFC starlet Sean Sugar O'Malley giving his 2 cents on the fight. After Jake's showing against the Spider, Anderson Silva, Sean expressed how impressed he was when speaking to the MMA Hour. Considering how Sean is known for his accurate shots and impeccable striking power, being acknowledged by him is a testimony to just how good Jake is in the ring. He claimed that there is a good chance that the odds may just lean over in Jake's favor when it comes to boxing. After all, Paul's trajectory in boxing is only peaking as he looks more seasoned with every fight. That being said, what will happen in the octagon? Well, on his podcast, Sean recently expressed how Nate would probably choke Jake when he entered Nate's domain. Now, the octagon is still uncharted territory for Jake, so just like Sean, we're all curious to see if he can disrupt the MMA game as he did in boxing. Now for more praise for Jake. Initially, it was tough to digest for any boxing or MMA fanatic to accept Jake as being anything as good as average in the sport. Perhaps it was just the idea of a YouTuber knocking out the likes of Ben Askren or pummeling Tyron Woodley not once but twice. Jake's carefree personality wasn't necessarily a favorite among enthusiasts either, but it's funny to look at all that now, only to have pro fighters come out and praise Jake for his fighting skills. Another big name from the UFC has shared his predictions, this time giving a straight-out warning for Nate Diaz. Former lightweight champion Frankie Edgar came out alongside Brian Callen and Brendan Schaub on the TF-ATK podcast, speaking on the dangers of going in the ring with the problem child. On the podcast, Brendan and Edgar claimed Jake is now the real deal and that he has submitted himself as a true fighter. Edgar added to Jake's praise, saying that Silva really gave it his all to win against Jake. On top of that, WBC president Mauricio Suleiman acknowledged Jake's performance against Anderson Silva, dubbing him a legit fighter. If not worry per se, Nate should at the very least take Jake seriously if he goes toe-to-toe with him in the ring. Following up, the build-up. Every great rivalry in the Hurt game has a heated build-up, and needless to say, Nate and Jake have some history. As we're counting down to a possible fight deal between Jake and Diaz, the trash talk is only getting started. Nate Diaz recently came out on Twitter with a video where he's seen trolling Jake's dad, Greg. In the video, we see Greg praising Nate, saying that he admires the Stockton-born fighter and wishes to see him compete against Jake one day. Nate and Greg embraced at the end of the confrontation, only for the video to jump cut to Greg Paul on his eldest son, Logan Paul's podcast. And let's just say his words on Nate weren't all respectful. Greg was seen arrogantly claiming that his son would knock Nate out, calling him a punk with a mediocre record. Ouch. What's more, Nate's caption on the video said it all, reading, "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree," followed by some colorful words for the Paul family. Now, Greg Paul has been present in both of his son's fights on ringside, while Nate was a new visitor at the Jake Paul vs. Anderson Silva event, though Nate was later escorted out of the arena after an altercation with Jake's security personnel. Not to mention, Jake was later seen calling Nate out on the mic, adding fuel to the fire and laying the foundations for the story we are seeing today. Diaz has not replied on the prolific two-fight deal and remained quiet on public trash talk. His recent post on Twitter seems promising for the future of the fight, not to mention all the speculation. If you had asked a year ago who'd win in a bout between Jake and Diaz, you'd be crazy to think Jake stood a chance. Nate Diaz has years of MMA experience, with his striking power revered among the Conor McGregors of the sport. With that said, having 4 stoppage victories to his belt, Jake has proven himself to be quite the knockout artist. He's patient and can go the distance, as we saw him do against Anderson Silva. If we talk numbers, Jake has a serious size advantage over Nate, weighing as he sits at over 200 pounds compared to Nate's peak 177. It's hard to see Nate knocking out Jake, with the fight likely going the distance in the favor of Jake Paul. That being said, the Ohio-born athlete hasn't competed under Queensberry rules. Nate has 34 matchups under his belt and has been revered among the top 10 in UFC for a long time. As the Stockton fighter has announced his exit from the UFC, his legacy speaks for itself. It's hard to see Jake standing a chance of winning, although none of the speculations will have any substance unless Nate inks out the contract. Diaz has also hinted at his future with a cryptic tweet on January 6th showing MMA promotion Ryzen's logo. We've seen the likes of Floyd Money Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao sign for the upcoming promotion too. All in all, the Paul vs. Diaz fight is going to happen, though we wouldn't count on it to happen anytime in 2023. Let's look at KSI claims he's a bigger fight than Nate. Like Nate, Jake has collected a number of rivals through his run as a boxer. They don't call him the problem child for no reason. The fighter really knows how to rub someone the wrong way, though his biggest rival is someone who's been at the inception and forefront of YouTube, the Nightmare KSI. The British box tuber has been chasing Jake and wants to get the W against him before he hangs up the gloves on his boxing career. When speaking to Ariel Helwani on MMA Hour, KSI shared his thoughts on which fight is bigger, his bout against Jake or Jake versus Nate Diaz. KSI emphasized how both he and Jake have been going back and forth for years now and agreed that his fight with Jake will be the one to sell the most tickets. If you know anything about the YouTube boxing scene, you very well know how all of this started. After KSI's win against fellow British YouTuber Joe Weller, KSI initially called out Jake Paul, but eventually ended up fighting his brother Logan. As KSI took a break from boxing, Jake began cleaning the house with whoever stepped in his way, a streak that now stands at 6-0. Where KSI started as the A-side, the story is much different now. The two are expected to clash at the Wembley Arena at the end of 2023. If you compare the two fights, where Nate Diaz versus Jake is pure fan service, Jake taking on KSI is a much bigger story. Finally, is the PFL good for MMA? Whether Nate Diaz versus Jake Paul comes through or not, the Professional Fighter Leagues is on its way to dethroning the UFC as the supreme MMA promotion. Announcing himself as the head of fighter advocacy, Jake looks to bring independence to fighter contracts, giving them the freedom to choose their own sponsorship deals and earn good pay for laying their lives on the line. The Superfight division is designed to attract larger audiences to the sport, going straight to pay-per-view, and considering each match will have an equal share of the collections, the proposition seems too good to be true. Say what you will about Paul, he has been a voice for the voiceless in MMA. If you're Dana White, you better be making phone calls. That's a wrap for this video. What are your predictions on Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you at the next one.